What's up, Final Cut Pro Help Live viewers? My name is Jared Ewing. You are here on the round 2 preview show. I'm so excited for this because we're going to be talking about the shortcuts that move on to the second round of the battle to find the shortcut of the year. If you are watching on YouTube, awesome, youtube.com/Final Cut Pro Help. We're going to be showing a keynote here that'll uncover all of the shortcuts that have made it on for the votes, especially all of you that are watching live on Instagram. It's the first time we're doing this. Hopefully this all comes through. Any feedback you have, don't hesitate. Send me a direct message as I see all the waves in there. Thank you so much for joining this stream. And voting. If you've been online voting, that's the best thing because we've gotten hundreds, if not thousands of votes for these shortcuts to find out which ones are most useful. The whole point, of course, is to have some fun with it, but for you guys to discover some shortcuts that maybe you hadn't been using before and how to work them into your workflow. That's always the best thing there. So let's go into this again. My name is Jared Ewing. This is the 2019 Shortcut of the Year Round 1 review and Round 2 preview show. So we've been voting for the past week or so. Hopefully all of you on Instagram have seen those stories. You've been voting on there, which is awesome. We got tons of votes. Some of these shortcuts, we got too many votes for both sides. It was tied up until even just about an hour ago. It stressed me out making everything. I couldn't make some predictions. Had to wait till the last votes came in. Had to go on to Twitter for a couple of the tiebreakers, which is fun. I mean, it was a lot of fun watching all these votes come in. A lot of work, but hopefully you guys will have some fun with this. So let's dive into it. I'm going to exit out of my presentation here. I made a little video to uncover these shortcuts and figure out which ones make it onto the next round. Before I do that, let me check the audio. Looks like we're all good on there. So let's do this. Again, any feedback you have, whether you're watching on YouTube or live here on Instagram, please give me a message there. Let me know what you think, what feedback you have, what you want to see for the future streams. And this is the kind of a special edition of Final Cut Pro Help Live where we're doing this whole bracket thing this month to find these shortcuts. But if you're new to the channel, tune in the first of every month. We do a live stream that's a demo of some feature in Final Cut. Sometimes it's motion, and then we do a bunch of Q&A. So if you got questions, don't hesitate. Send them on over. So let's dive into this little video. We'll see how this goes. Hopefully I got everything right. I have my own bracket and my cheat sheet here of the results, so we'll see what happens. If you filled out your own bracket and went on to anawesomeguide.com and filled it out, awesome. You can see how your voting goes. I have not checked on my actual choices, but I know some of them did not go the way I expected them to go. You guys voted some interesting shortcuts onto the next round. And then let me get my stats up here on my iPad because I have all the votes and how it went, and we'll break it down here. This will be good. So we're going to go up to the top left of the bracket for the first voting to see how this goes. The first shortcut that we voted on, if you were following along with the votes, was the pretty popular ones, Command-C for copy and Command-V for paste. Of course, those are very common shortcuts in any app, especially for editing. I wanted to see how it turned out, which one you guys use a little bit more or less. So let's see how this went for this one. Again, if you're watching on Instagram, switch over, tune in on YouTube, youtube.com/Final Cut Pro Help. You'll see the keynote, see the presentation, what I'm doing there. If you're on YouTube and you want to see my face for some reason, you can go over to Instagram at Final Cut Pro Help. So there's the results. Command-C, it might be a little hard to see the green there, but Command-C overwhelmingly beat out Command-V, which makes sense because you can use copy for everything. So that one moves on to the next round. Then we had E and W, E for appending and a selection to the storyline, and W for inserting that selection to the storyline, and E beat out W on that one as well. That was a much closer race there compared to Command-C and Command-V, but E is going to move on to face Command-C in the second round. So again, when you see these kind of have 4 different shortcuts all together, when the winners of those 2 is going to go on to face the next shortcut in the second round, which starts this coming Friday. In just 2 days here. It's going to start up. Might start tonight. We'll see. But probably tomorrow we're going to see those votings come through. So Tons of votes on there, but again, Command C got 72% of the vote, and E got 55% of the vote for those two to move on. So then we had V for enabling or disabling a clip, going up against an N, which enables or disables snapping. Both great features. N, more of a feature, versus V, which is a more when you're selecting clips on there. So very different ones, but on this one, V, which I thought N was going to be the one to move on here, but V for enabling or disabling a clip does get 70% of the vote and is able to move on to the second round. Very helpful shortcut. If you're not using V, it's a helpful shortcut if you know what it does, because you can take some B-roll, for example, hit V to disable the B-roll, then you're viewing just your primary storyline or the clips below it. So you can watch the interview if that's what you're trying to do, or re-enable those clips. Also works on audio. So if there's music, for example, and you're listening to the interview or the primary content, you don't want to hear that music, just select it, hit V, it temporarily disables it until you re-enable it. Then you're not having to go through and mute a clip and then unmute, which, I mean, it's a mess if you're doing that. So V, very helpful shortcut, and I agree that's why it moved on. Snapping is also very useful, but enabling and disabling it, there's a button on the toolbar you can do it. So don't necessarily need that shortcut, but it did make it onto this bracket for a reason. It's still a very helpful one. All right, moving on, we have option W, which overwhelmingly beat over Shift F for reveal in browser. Option W inserts a gap clip, and that's why it got 68% of the vote. So it's going on to round 2. So that's the first 4 battles up there. We're going to move down a little bit here. We have Shift Delete and Delete. I'm going to be honest here. This did not go the way I thought it was going to go. I did not expect this to be a close vote. And it wasn't, because one of these got 66% of the vote, and I did not see this. Delete, the delete key is something I use all the time, but for some reason, Shift Delete got way more votes here with replacing an item with a gap clip. So that's going to move on to the next round. Moving on down, we have option left bracket, got overwhelmingly beat by Command B to blade at the playheader skimmer location. So this one, I think so far with all of our shortcuts, let's see, what did this one get? B got 73% of the votes. I think that's the most we've had so far here. So Command B moves on to the second round. Next, moving on down, we have Shift Period. If you use this shortcut, it nudges the selection to the right, but the grave accent actually beat it out. And that's a way that you can override clip connections. This is a shortcut I have taught many, I would say pretty advanced, and people have been editing for years, didn't know that the grave accent is a thing inside of Final Cut Pro. And if you did not know this or you haven't used this, try it out. When you have a selection that you're moving around the timeline, you can hold down the grave accent, which is the key to the left of the number 1. If you're watching on Instagram, it's this one over here next to the number 1 key, or above the tab key. And the grave accent, when you're overriding those clip connections, this allows you to move something that is connected, and it doesn't affect any of the connected clips. So the magnetic timeline is a great thing, but sometimes you don't want it to stay connected. You want to take away the magnetization, and the grave accent can kind of do that. So that one moves on. This one, though, this was the last one. If you've been watching on Instagram, this went down to just about an hour ago. This is one of the last votes that came in. So beat out Shift Period there. Had, what was it, like 53% of the vote there to move on to round 2, just barely. And it's going to go up against the winner of the next one, which we have Shift Command GE to break apart a clip item, and Option Command down arrow to override the primary storyline. This was another very, very close voting battle here. But Shift Command G, which when you have a selection, say like a compound clip, you can do Shift Command G, and it's going to break apart each of those clips into their original components. So if you've grouped a whole bunch of stuff and you don't want it grouped anymore, you can use Shift Command G, and that'll break them all apart. Similar, Option Command W, another very useful shortcut. If you have a selection, it just overrides it down onto the primary storyline. So with either of those, those are shortcuts, if you're not using them, try them out. They're very helpful and big time savers too, especially that Option Command down arrow. I know it's not moving on, but it's still a very useful shortcut just to override things down. So many people I've been watching, especially on Instagram, I've seen a lot of tags here with Final Cut where people just put a gap clip on the primary storyline and then you connect a whole bunch of clips to it. You're defeating the whole point of the magnetic timeline and not taking advantage of it. But if you have a selection and you know it's your primary footage, use this Option Command down arrow shortcut, put it down there on the timeline and on that primary storyline, and try it out. Get used to it. It's extremely helpful in the long run there. So, those are those 4 groups. So let's move on down to the next area of our bracket here, where we have Command 4 that went up against Shift Command 2. This one, Command 4, no contest. That shows or hides the inspector, beat out the timeline index. Timeline index is useful, but not as useful as the inspector. And then the show hide audio meters at Shift Command 8 just barely squeaked out against Control Command 1 for showing or hiding the browser. So the Shift Command 8 is going to go up against Command 4 in the second round. We then have Command K and Option Command K. And Command K overwhelmingly beat out Option Command K. I do want to apologize. If you looked at the bracket show last time, the first one, Option Command K for customizing the keyboard somehow made it onto the bracket twice. It also was over on the right side. That was an oversight on my part, and we've corrected that. There's another shortcut that's in there that I realized during the show, just after. I'm like, wait, that shortcut was on there twice. And somehow it had been categorized twice in the keyboard customization in the actual thing that this shortcut brings up. So that's why that came up twice there. But that's corrected, so you're only going to see it over on this side. And then moving on down, we have Command 2 and Command 6. This one did not go the way I thought it was going to go either. I find going to the timeline, making the timeline active is pretty important, but apparently you guys like the color inspector a little bit more. So the color inspector is moving on to the second round of our shortcuts there. So that is that area of the timeline. Next one, we have Shift Command I to set an additional range in point. Went against M to add a marker. Marker is a little bit more important there for most of you. So M moves on. Same thing then, we have F for marking a selection as a favorite. Went up against I for setting a range start or end point. F, marking favorite, that's one of my favorites as well. So that moves on to the next round. Then we have the tools. And these next 2 winners, I don't think it was anything that's a surprise, but we have the letter B to activate the blade tool moving on, and same thing, the letter A to activate the arrow or selection tool is moving on, and those 2 are going to face up against each other in the next round. That's going to be a close battle, I believe, for which one moves on to the next round. So that's that side of the bracket. Let's move on over to the bottom right side, and then we'll make our way up the bracket from here. So we have right arrow and shift right arrow. I could not believe how close this voting was. This one was tied up on the Instagram votes at 50% each side. Went over to Twitter and a couple other places to get some additional votes. And even on Twitter, I think I did a 2-hour or a 2-day poll on there. And man, that one stayed tied for most of the time as well. So right arrow, which I thought was going to be hands down the one to move on, goes up against shift right arrow. And apparently you guys got going ahead 10 frames or 10 units there. But by literally one vote on here, I saw right arrow went on ahead and is going to beat out shift right arrow. So right arrow moves on. Then going on up, we have semicolon is taking the win there and is going to go up against right arrow in the next battle. Semicolon, of course, to navigate to the previous edit. Apparently you guys like to go back edits instead of forward edits. That's totally fine. And then we have control apostrophe and option semicolon. Control apostrophe to go to the next marker. And these are all navigation shortcuts For the timeline, which are very helpful, save a lot of time, that one's going to go up against S, which enables or disables skimming. And as opposed to the timeline history. Timeline history is great. A lot of people don't use the timeline history. They just work on one project at a time. But if you're like me, sometimes you'll have 10, 20 different projects that you're switching between. Because you have a whole bunch of videos in a series, for example. So I like the timeline history. It's a shame it's not moving on, but skimming is something that I usually keep on all the time. And I think skimming is great, but sometimes you do want to disable that. So you can just press the S key to disable skimming when you don't want that one. That one got 58% of the vote for skimming, so that one moves on. And again, I see a whole bunch of people joining on Instagram. If you're watching over there, head over to youtube.com/Final Cut Pro Help. We have the whole bracket up there on live. And if you have been voting on the Final Cut Pro Help stories, continue to vote. Thank you so much for that. That helps out in letting us know what you think is the better shortcut and what you want to see on there. And if you're not following, if you're listening to this on YouTube, follow at Final Cut Pro Help on Instagram, and you'll be able to vote on the stories that come up and help determine which shortcuts move on. We're at 64 shortcuts from round one. Right now we're cutting it down to 32 shortcuts that are going to move on. So this was the lower right side of the bracket. So let's move on up the bracket to see the next set of shortcuts, which is starting out with option spacebar to play from the playhead, going against the home key, which goes to the beginning of a selection. So in addition to navigating the timeline back to the beginning of the timeline, the home key can also go to say the beginning of a selection with text and other things on there. And many of you, especially if you're on a portable machine or like me, I'm using the smaller keyboard, if you don't have the home key, you'll have a function key, usually in the lower left corner. If you hold the function key and press the left arrow, that's the same thing as pressing the home key to go to the beginning. Now, in my opinion, what I thought was going to happen here is that the home key was definitely going to win this one, because I don't think the option spacebar to play from the playhead is that necessary, because in most cases, most scenarios, just hit the spacebar and it plays from the playhead anyway if that's not selected. You might have your skimmer, which plays from there if you're on the timeline, but if you're up in the viewer somewhere else, usually it'll play from the playhead anyway. However, we got 60% of the vote going to option spacebar, so that one's going to move on to the second round, and it's going to go up against the winner of slash and Command L, which Command L to enable or disable loop playback. It moved on there. Also a surprise, I find selecting something on the timeline, which is either a clip, a transition, you can use the range selection tool to select a range, and then use this slash to play that selection. I find that slash key, for me, that's the one I use very frequently, and I usually don't enable or disable loop playback. Usually it's either on or it's off, and it's going to be on or off for a pretty long period of time there. So I thought slash was going to move on, but Command L got more of the votes, so it moves on to the next round there. Then moving on up, we have spacebar for play pause. No surprise there. And then we have J to reverse a playback reverse versus L to play forward. And this didn't surprise me. This is what I expect, because the spacebar makes sense, right? You're playing and pausing your content all the time, whether you're previewing it in the browser or playing back your project. No surprise, I thought that was going to go the way it did. And then J for playing reverse, you can hit J a whole bunch of times to go back. And what I do very frequently, I'll hit the J key a couple times, hit the space bar to pause the rewinding, and hit the space bar again to play back something. So I usually don't use L to play something or to fast forward as much as I'm using J. So both of them, J, K, and L, and the space bar, all four of those keys are very, very useful. But I agree with the way the votes went here. J, definitely a more useful shortcut. It'll be interesting to see if the spacebar or the J, which one makes it on to the next round there, because both of those are pretty useful. Spacebar for a lot of newer editors is probably one where you're like, no question, the spacebar is definitely what I'd use. But for those of you that have been editing for a while, especially tons of footage, you know how important that J key is. So let's move on up. We have Shift Command V going up against Command T. Shift Command V to paste attributes. I think that's the most useful shortcut on this board. That one moves on. Command T is great for adding a default transition. However, the attributes saves you so much time. If you have not used this shortcut or don't know what paste attributes does, do a little research. It is a fantastic shortcut, saves a ton of time for all of you doing effects work there. The next one we have is Shift B for blade speed, beat out the retime editor, which kind of makes sense that you can use Shift B to cut and make a blade speed adjustment. And if you're doing anything with fast motion, slow motion, you're doing any of those speed changes, blade speed allows you to cut that speed adjustment and change those segments. So instead of just saying slow this clip down to 50%, you can cut the speed and then slowly ramp down to your slow motion. So instead of it just being 100% playback and then all of a sudden it's half speed, use this blade speed. You can cut that speed, slow something down, speed something up. It's a very useful shortcut there. So great job, blade speed, votes, moved on. Next one, Control R for render selection versus Control Shift R for render all. I thought render all was gonna beat on, but the Control R render selection does beat out render all. And if you don't know, Final Cut has a great background rendering feature. There seems to be, I still haven't confirmed this, but I've seen enough cases, I'm pretty sure this is the case. In the most recent update, there was a change in a setting for the background rendering. And if you've been having issues with Final Cut stalling, you've been seeing that spinning beach ball come up, it's possible that the background rendering setting is too short, meaning background rendering is starting after 0.3 seconds. So a third of a second and background rendering is trying to start. I believe that's causing issues with some people. I've seen some recommendations to turn off background rendering, which again, for some situations, that's definitely what you want to do. But if you've been having issues with your rendering, I recommend going in to your preferences, Final Cut preferences, and make sure that background rendering is starting after a few seconds. Me personally, I've set it to 20 seconds because I want it to be something where if I get up and leave my machine, then background rendering starts. But for most people, 4 to 5 seconds seems to work pretty well. You have a machine there that's extremely powerful. Final Cut, one of the best features, in my opinion, is this ability to work behind the scenes, and background rendering is part of that. So I've seen a lot of professional editors say disable background rendering. It's not helpful. It's slowing down your machine. It's taking up more space. And in some cases, that is very true. However, for most editors, you want to take advantage of the performance of your machine. And if you can be rendering in the background and you know how to manage your render files, there's nothing wrong with the background rendering there. So I think it's great. But if you don't use background rendering, that's where these shortcuts come in. You may want to render everything on your timeline, or you want to render a selection. So if you're not using background rendering, you might select something on the timeline, a transition you've just added, an effect you've just created, color correction, all that kind of stuff. You might select it and then just render that selection. So that's where Control R comes in. I found, for me in my own workflow, Control Shift R to render all. But again, I'm using background rendering, so that's why I thought that. But if you're not, it makes sense. Control R moves on. And it's going to go up against either Command I or Shift Command R. And most of us are importing content. This one I didn't think was going to be as big of a swing over to Command I to win that one. Because in most cases, when you connect a camera, you connect a memory card, usually the import window is going to come up anyway, but I get it. Command I brings up that import window, so that moves on to face Control R in the second round. All right, getting towards the end here of this bracket and what shows up here. Command comma to open up the preferences. I just talked about that, changing your background rendering setting there, and then Command Q to quit Final Cut. Honestly, Command Q wasn't even on the radar for me for these shortcuts. And you guys voted this one in onto the bracket, and guess what? It gets most of the votes here in the first round. Very close, but it gets most of the votes, and that's going to move on to the second one. I guess when you guys are done editing for the day, you just want to be gone, so you're going to quit Final Cut as fast as you can to get out of that editing suite and move on. So Command Q moves on there, so that makes sense. Command Z, Shift Command Z. No surprise here. Command Z to undo something gets most of the votes and moves on. We all like to undo our mistakes as editors. We are editing and trying things, so it makes sense that Command Z is on there for that one. Going up next, we have Option Command 2 to toggle the film strip view. Lost out to Command minus to zoom out of something overwhelmingly. Yeah, that's a shame. The film strip view versus the list view is up in the browser. I switch between this all the time, but I'll be honest, I don't usually use the shortcut. I usually click on the little button that's there, so that's okay. Command minus I do use a lot. I will say, though, I use Shift Z more than I use Command minus. Shift Z will fit whatever you're looking at into the view. So if it's up in the viewer and you've zoomed in on something to maybe do a little correction, you can hit Shift Z and it'll fit it to 100%. If you're on the timeline and you've zoomed way in to edit something, you can use Shift Z to fit the entire timeline in the view there. So I find Shift Z is a very useful one. The video animation is great too for very specific adjustments and seeing how your animation, whether it be keyframes for audio or video in your effects, all of that, the video and audio animation options are great there, but not as great as Shift Z, so that shortcut moves on to the next round. All right, and then that is it. Those are the 32 shortcuts that are going to move on to the second round for the 2019 Shortcut of the Year and get our second year. So we've narrowed it down from 64 shortcuts to 32, getting a little bit closer there. So make sure if you're watching this on Instagram, make sure to go and subscribe on youtube.com/FinalCutProHelp. That way you can go and see these shows. You can see how the brackets go and all that good stuff. However, for those of you watching on YouTube, Instagram's going to be where you want to be because that's where these polls are happening. That's where we're collecting these votes. So you'll see these on the Final Cut Pro Help story, in addition to all the tips that have been posted with keyboard shortcuts and other things. That's where you can vote for what shortcut you think should move on to the next rounds here. So make sure to vote there. If you don't have Instagram, don't have access to the story, having issues, no big deal. You can always email your votes to finalcutprohelp@me.com. If the junk filtering doesn't get it, in my eyes, I don't see it for some reason, if you don't hear anything back from me, send me another email. No worries. I'll get back to you at some point. I try to respond to all those, especially through the email. That's the best way to get a hold of me there. Otherwise, you see the links on there to follow the content. And again, if you're on Instagram, go jump over to YouTube, see all the things there. I hope everyone here is having a wonderful day in whatever you're doing. If you don't know, I'm going to show you here on YouTube. Let's hide this QuickTime movie. If you don't know, our website is anawesomeguide.com. You saw it on the video there. There is a bracket set up, and it's a numbers spreadsheet. And on anawesomeguide.com, you can go and see this bracket, is this numbers spreadsheet here. Right after this stream is over, I'm going to go and update this with all the round 2 shortcuts that moved on. But you can go on there, view this bracket live. You can download a copy of it if you want, fill it out going all the way up. If you have guesses who's going to make it on, message me, direct message me, get a hold of me, send me an email, fill out your bracket, send that to me too. If you're on Instagram right now, you can see I've filled out mine. So I'm curious what you guys think is going to happen in here as it goes through. You can see the schedule at the top too. Starting March 22nd, which is tomorrow, we're going to start round 2 voting. It's going to be on Instagram. We'll see how you guys feel for that. And then again, subscribe on YouTube. Each month, on the first of the month, I try to do a live stream, Final Cut Pro Help Live, just like we're doing here. But in that show, the monthly show, we demo some features and we do a Q&A. So if you have questions, you can send them on in. I try to answer them right there, but a lot of times I'll demo some of those questions and show some things. But what we're going to do for this month's live show on April 1st is we're going to go through the top 16 shortcuts. So all the shortcuts that are voted here, I'm going to go through the top 16 and demo those and explain those in much greater detail than what I'm doing here and show you how those are used and at least how I use them So if there's shortcuts you're voting and putting on in, and you're not too sure what they do, that stream should help out in seeing some of these shortcuts and what they can do. So don't hesitate. Make sure to go over there, subscribe. You can always unsubscribe later if you don't find the content useful. Totally fine. I'm not worried about that. And then make sure to go here and awesomeguide.com. There's a link on there where you can do /2019 shortcut of the year. You can see the bracket on there, print it out, see all of the recent live shows, all that good stuff. So until next time, make sure to follow at Final Cut Pro Help on all of the social medias and all the good stuff out there. And thank you so much for all those that tuned in on Instagram. We've done a couple smaller live streams on Instagram, but this is the first time I'm streaming an entire show. Let me know what you think. Obviously, all you have to do is look at me. I'm sorry that it's not the most pleasant thing, but hopefully got something out of this and have switched over, watching on YouTube, all the good stuff. But for those on Instagram, thank you so much for joining. Make sure to get your votes in as you see those come through. If you know someone that would find this content useful and you think that they would benefit from either seeing the shortcut posts that are down below or seeing some of these tips and tricks coming across the stories, pass it along, send it to them. That's the best way to grow this, to keep this content creating by having a bigger audience. So all of those on Instagram, thank you so much for joining. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And as far as you on YouTube, same thing. I hope you have a wonderful day and are excited about what you saw here with this bracket and the shortcuts that have moved on. But again, if you know someone that would find this useful or interesting, don't hesitate to send them to the website where they can download this bracket and print it out. And you can see it too. Bookmark it. You can go back to it, see how the shortcuts are changing. And that's going to be updated in just a few minutes after this stream ends. So thank you all. And I hope you have, like I said, a wonderful rest of your day. Until next time, see you later.